Hello folks, this new video is intended for you to access with me the content that you have in the two chapters from this book, The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, that we ask you to read and study from. First of all, I would like to address this notion or the usage that the author makes of the word instinct, because you are not asked to read his first chapter in which he addresses the reason why he chooses this notion in particular. So instinct is the word in focus, and in this first chapter that I'm reading from, he says that he chooses the word because it conveys the idea that people know how to talk in more or less the sense that spiders know how to spin webs. Web spinning was not invented by some unsung spider genius and does not depend on having had the right education or on having an aptitude for architecture or the construction trades. Rather, spiders spin spider webs because they have spider brains, which give them the urge to spin and the competence to succeed. Although there are differences between webs and words, I will encourage you to see language in this way, for it helps to make sense of the phenomena we will explore. So his point is that language is not a cultural artifact that we learn the way we learn to tell time or how the federal government works. Instead, he says, language is a distinct piece of the biological makeup of our brains. He also indicates that in his view, language is a biological adaptation to communicate information. So therefore, what he's saying is that we have this, predisposition for this ability, the language ability, but that it has come to be the way it is as evidence of how our species has adapted itself to the environment it has been surrounded by. He takes a Darwinian approach, say, to language and sees it as, how our species adapted itself to the need it had to communicate information in the environment it lived in. He also makes room in his introduction to saying a few words about Chomsky, and he says that the most famous argument that language is like an instinct in this century comes from Noam Chomsky, the linguist who first unmasked the intricacy of the system and perhaps the person most responsible for the modern revolution in language and cognitive science. He continues, in the 1950s, the social sciences were dominated by behaviorism, the school of thought popularized by John Watson and B.F. Skinner. Mental terms like know and think were branded as unscientific. Mind and innate were dirty words. behavior was explained by a few laws of stimulus-response learning that could be studied with rats pressing bars and dogs salivating to tones. But Chomsky called attention to two fundamental facts about language. So Chomsky calling attention to two fundamental facts about language. Number one, virtually every sentence that a person utters or understands is a brand new combination of words, appearing for the first time in the history of the universe. Therefore, a language cannot be a repertoire of responses. The brain must contain a recipe or program that can build an unlimited set of sentences out of a finite list of words. That program may be called a mental grammar. So, this is accounted for by the fact that we are able to produce and interpret an unlimited number of sentences out of a finite number of words. Sentences that we were never exposed to before and are still part of the language we are becoming speakers of. And the second fundamental fact, so number two, is that children develop these complex grammars rapidly and without formal instruction and grow up to give consistent interpretations to novel sentence constructions that they have never before encountered. Therefore, he argued, children must innately be equipped with a plan common to the grammars of all languages. That is, a universal grammar, that tells these children how to distill the syntactic patterns out of the speech of their parents. So we are capable then, after a period of immersion in a linguistic context, to understand what underpins the speech that surrounds us. What is it that allows us to produce and then be understood using language in a way that is possible, that is grammatical in the context, in the linguistic context that we are immersed in. And last, the last point that I would like to highlight from his introductory chapter is that he says the following: the story I will tell in this book has of course been deeply influenced by Chomsky. So he acknowledges that Chomsky has made a very deep, contribution to his own understanding of language. But it is not this story exactly. It is not Chomsky's stories exactly. And I will not tell it as he would. Chomsky has puzzled many readers with his skepticism about whether Darwinian natural selection can explain the origins of the language organ that he argues for. So he's saying that Chomsky himself is not really sure, at least from his ideas and how he has expressed them, that we can take a Darwinian, understanding of how is it that we ended up with the instinct for language that we have. In contrast, Pinker says, I think it fruitful to consider language as an evolutionary adaptation. So language, this is Pinker's, right? Language as an evolutionary adaptation. Why? Because he says, I think it fruitful to consider language as an evolutionary adaptation like the eye. Its major parts designed to carry out important functions. And Chomsky's arguments about the nature of the language faculty are based on technical analyses of word and sentence structure, often couched in abstruse formalisms. His discussions of flesh and blood speakers are perfunctory and highly idealized. Though I happen to agree with many of his arguments, I think that a conclusion about the mind is convincing only if many kinds of evidence converge on it. So the story in this book is highly eclectic, ranging from how DNA builds brains to the pontifications of newspaper language columnists. The best place to begin is to ask why anyone should believe that human language is part of human biology, an instinct at all. So this is somehow he's anticipating the reason why we come up in the 2 chapters that we ask you to read, instances of evidence that are, found, that are part of different sources, say newspaper articles, literary texts, dialogues, conversations that he transcribes, conversations among friends. He uses all sorts of evidence to justify his position as his view of language as an instinct, that is to say, as our species' evolutionary adaptation to its environment to meet the need it had to communicate information.